We're here with Amy McDonnell from the University of Utah Applied Cognition Lab. You're a research faculty. Am I getting that right?
Research fellow.
Amy has a background in wilderness therapy. Obviously, probably spent a lot of time in the wilderness or in nature, doing naturey stuff before coming to the Applied Cognition Lab, and has some really interesting research working with us right now on probably a very small part of what you do, but working with us on getting some data on the impact of wilderness programs with veterans, and that's going into some other programs that we're doing. But we wanted to take an opportunity to record a conversation with Amy to just hear more about your background, what got you into this, what you're learning, and hear a little bit more about how applied cognition and wilderness go together. Let's start, Amy, with just hearing a little bit of your background. I kind of told your story based on what I read from the bio and conversations we've had, but I'd love to hear how you got to the Applied Cognition Lab and into the work that you're doing.
I'd say my path to getting here was pretty curvy in terms of my background studies and some of the odd jobs I've had. Growing up, my family vacations were always camping trips. Grew up in Southern California. That meant like long weekends were packing up the car and driving to Malibu Creek and camping an hour outside of LA. But I always was drawn to being outside, but also fell in love with neuroscience at a pretty young age when I was late high school years, and just slumped into any book I could find about the brain. I was so fascinated by how this 3-pound organ in your body really governs who you are, what you experience in the world, and pursued that path in college of studying neuroscience. And graduating from college, I really didn't want to get a job yet, and hiked along the Pacific Crest Trail for a few months, which really just like deepened my connection with nature. And on that trail, thought a lot about how can I combine my passion for being outside in these wilderness settings with my academic interest in neuroscience, which the two just seemingly really do not relate to each other at all, until I came across the work of Dave Strayer here at the University of Utah. I was working in a quite a boring research job in LA after hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, and I was sitting there reading a National Geographic article called "This Is Your Brain on Nature," and came across David Strayer's work here at the University of Utah, and it all clicked for me of, whoa, I can do both of those things in one job. So as I was applying to graduate school, I moved to Southern Utah to work in wilderness therapy as a backpacking guide. Did that for a couple years while I applied, and eventually got into graduate school studying the effects of being in nature on your brain, and stayed in this lab because I love it so much. And it's, like I said, just perfectly blends the two things that I think make me who I am. So that's how I ended up here.
Now I have about 10 different threads to follow. The first one is, what was so interesting for you about the human brain? And how has that changed as you've, pursued that? And also pursued the parallel track of wilderness and nature impact on the brain.
First introduction to the brain was watching my grandma have a stroke, where it was like one day she was herself and the next day lost her ability to speak and comprehend a lot of the world around her and walk. And I was 15 at the time, and my young just couldn't wrap itself around what could have possibly happened to have these effects. So I really became interested in it for those neurodiverse situations of brain damage and the effects of brain damage on behavior. I mean, that theme has even found itself into my work today of working specifically with participants that might have some sort of mental health diagnosis, be it anxiety, depression, PTSD, or we do some work with some epilepsy patients up in the hospital. So I'm really drawn to that idea of not only understanding how the brain works when the brain is working, but also what goes wrong, or what are the impacts on behavior and mental health when something goes wrong in the brain, that I'm super fascinated by.
How does nature or the nature experience fit with that interest?
That is a good question, because that's actually one of the main like pillars of interest in our field of like this environmental neuroscience field, we call it, where we're new enough field where we're trying to just simply understand like what happens in the brain and the body, if anything, when people are immersed in natural environments. And we're on the quest for what we call like biomarkers or like neural signatures of that experience. So what is changing when you're in different types of environments? And the hope is that once we find what those biomarkers, those like measurable effects are, that we can then apply that to what the what researchers would call special populations. I don't know how good of a descriptor that is, but these situations with physical or mental illness diagnoses, like how can what we have learned about the brain in different environments be applied to different conditions? There's been some work that's really impressive and good work out of from Greg Bratman when he was at Stanford at the time, looking at an area of the brain related to symptoms of depression. Rumination being like the pattern of negative self-referential thought, is housed in an area of the brain called the subgenual prefrontal cortex. Greg Bratman's work looked at this area of the brain before and after, like a 90-minute walk in nature versus a 90-minute walk in an urban environment, and found a down regulation of that hub in the brain, like highly related to symptoms of depression. So that's one of the only science studies that specifically looked at an area in the brain related to some sort of mental health diagnosis. But there's been plenty of behavioral, just like performance on cognitive tasks research that's looked at people with major depressive disorder diagnoses or generalized anxiety disorder. ADHD is a big one in our field because we study often attention in the brain and how immersion in nature can help kind of restore the resources that you need to draw upon to focus. So as you could imagine, with that large body of literature, that there's such an application for people that have an ADHD diagnosis. A lot of the work has kids, and walk in the park versus walk in an urban environment and see how it impacts symptoms. But I would definitely say the cognitive neuroscience side of this, I think we're probably one of just a handful of labs in the world that do it. There's a much bigger literature exploring all these impacts just from a self-report and behavioral standpoint of just looking at what people rate on questionnaires or performance on different tasks that relate to different like cognitive constructs.
Do you think that the neurosciences, like, I got 10 more threads. Obviously I have ADHD also.
He does.
But
He really does. Hence why we do nature work, Amy.
that's
Cool.
now, I was gonna say,
And mine's for all the depression and anxiety. You know what most serves you, hey?
do you think that the project of neuroscience is attempting to prove, does it make it more concrete, the impacts that people are self-reporting?
It's a really good question. And to be honest, everybody's going to report that being in nature makes them feel better. Like, why do we have to look into the brain and the body if we already know, even if at the very least it's a placebo effect? But if people are reporting, benefits to some of their symptoms of depression or stress, then, isn't that still having the outcome that we want? But the way I view it is within a medical system and a healthcare system that relies on evidence as to what the impact of any sort of treatment is on the brain and body. And so That's kind of the search of what are the measurable impacts on brain and body health. If, as I'm sure you guys are familiar with, there's a big push for Park's prescription program for doctors to actually prescribe time outside as a supplemental treatment or a first pass treatment for anxiety and depression, that I think to do so responsibly, we do need to better understand like what the impacts of that would be on the brain and the body, much like you would for like a pharmaceutical approach to treatment, right?
I've got a really sort of complicated question arising. And I don't quite even know how to ask it, because my experience of going out in nature and taking people out there into the wilderness is one which I would call spiritual, which in some ways is immeasurable. Do you know what I mean? And I really know the efficacy that you're talking about, and have experienced the efficacy of being able to put hard data around things which feel immeasurable. And so I guess I'm wondering about that. And the question in there is, there's something that opens up in that experience. How do you measure that?
Really great question. And something we wrestle with all the time. To your point, so much of the experience in nature is spiritual or has like a level of mysticism that maybe you can capture looking at stress physiology or changes in the brain, but I'd imagine that there's a level of it that you can't. This It's something I wrestle with a lot, and it relates to like also wrestling with just by measuring something, do we inherently alter the experience? Right? Like in the work that I do of like actually putting electrodes on somebody's scalp and sending them out into nature, are we changing the experience by putting these electrodes on people? And we call it I think it's the Heisenberg principle in psychology, that by observing something, you're changing how it acts. And I think that's going to be the real struggle of our field in trying to tap into what you're talking about, Miriam, of that spiritual side of it or mystical side of it, that with classic like scientific methodologies, you're going to with that. There's an approach similar to what we're doing with you all at Open Circle, but there's an approach to research too that's more qualitative, that maybe can provide a richer data set in terms of an individual's experience, where maybe not putting electrodes on them, not even asking them to fill out these, psychology questionnaires, but just a conversation approach that's like more qualitative and sometimes can provide a richer description of the experience, because participants aren't then confined to the way you asked the questions or the task that you've given them, that maybe would be the best approach, I think, at trying to tap into those more nuanced sides of this immersion in nature experience. But our lab hasn't really delved into that more qualitative aspect of it. But I would imagine that's going to be the best chance you have at trying to tap into some of those things. It's a really good question.
One of the things that struck me is in working with you and looking at the sort of higher level of connectivity is, I think, in going out into nature and having that greater connectivity, how could it not help us connect better to our lives? And there's almost a philosophical argument in there about what is it that helps us, connect better to our lives, live better lives. Is that being looked at as part of the evidence that you're creating?
The idea of presence that comes up a lot in the theories that drive our field, just in terms of in our day-to-day modern environments, which are often urban, 80% of people in the US live in urban environments, that there's a constant distraction that we're faced with all the time, whether that's work distraction, like social obligation distraction, technology distraction is what we study in our lab. That there are so few situations where we can really be present. And we think that that's one of the driving forces in time and nature, is that you are rid of all of those distractions, right? I mean, ideally, in our perspective, ideally, you do not have cell service. You don't even have your phone on you. You're away from work. You're often away from family dynamics or any of those things that allow you to almost clear out the clutter of your mind and just be present. That, at least anecdotally, I know from our participants, and I know that you've experienced with those that come through your program, of just like thought, I guess, that's born out of that, like being away from home, being fascinated by your environment, the environment having extent that you can explore in many directions, whether that's physically or mentally. And of course, like the other big facet of it for us is compatibility. That if the environment that you're in is compatible with your own goals, you're more likely to benefit from the environment. So yeah, we've all experienced, right? Like multi-day trips in the wilderness, changing the way that we view our lives and connect to our purpose in our lives. And I would imagine, I think both from our work and my personal experience, that is just a complete ability to let go of everything that's back there and just be present in my thoughts and environment.
The question you asked about spirituality, Miriam, I was thinking of, what does that even mean? When we provide a survey for the veterans groups that we're working with, that you all provided from the Applied Cognition Lab, and Amy put it together, I think, with all of these they're certified or approved scales. And some of them, I remember thinking, how does anybody even understand what this means unless they've had this experience? So, for example, there's a question, I feel connected to all things, or I feel a part of nature, or nature is part of me. There's questions like that. I wish I had it in front of me. And those are all things that I would associate with, a spiritual connection with, regardless of religion. And we might have different words for it, but the difference from the pre-test to the post-test was dramatic. It was almost, and I've talked to some of the veterans about it. Yeah, those questions, I was like, what is this crap at the beginning? And then afterwards, I totally got what they were asking. So I would just go back to that. I was like, that sounds like spiritual. That sounds like spirituality. We're outside of religion, and it can fit perfectly in any religion, really, those questions. I was curious if there's biomarkers for those experiences. I've read articles. I'm just an armchair, we're speaking to an expert, so you're going to hear weird theories. An armchair, like Time magazine versions of Neuroscience, but like biomarkers of the near death or end of life experiences, what's happening in the brain is really interesting, because again, that's another sort of spiritual liminal space that nobody can tell us what it's like, or very few people can tell us what it's like to have a near death experience. But there's stuff going on in the brain that's really interesting. I'm wondering if when we're not talking about feeling better, feeling less depressed, feeling more focused, those kind of things, but we're talking about these almost mystical experiences that can happen in nature. Are you looking at that? Are there biomarkers of that, or is that something that's like future for the Cognition Lab, or not considered at all?
Absolutely. If you come across any of those biomarkers in your Time magazine, you'll have to let us know. No, that's exactly kind of what we're searching for, is like, what are these things that are changing as they relate to the spiritual side, the attention restoration side, the stress recovery side. Most, if not all of our work revolves around attention and stress, but that doesn't mean that those other biomarkers aren't out there. We just haven't uncovered them yet. The closest thing that I'm familiar with to that idea might be some researchers study awe, is one of those constructs that's quite difficult to define and textualize within a scientific approach, but it's an evoked emotion, right, from something meaningful. So some researchers to study awe, which is such an abstract idea, but some people have looked at things, the stress response, activation of sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. One researcher, Paula Williams, here in the psych department at the University of Utah, studies piloerections, goosebumps, which theoretically, if you're experiencing awe, you would maybe have some goosebumps. So there are different ways that researchers are being creative to try to study that more difficult to objective, measurable metric out of, but I think it's there. What that looks like in the brain, I'm not entirely sure. But that's the promise of our field, is a lot of it is uncharted territory. The irony of all of it to me is we're using these advancements in neurotechnologies to study something that we knew thousands of years ago.
Totally. And I mean, I'm wondering if there's an overlap in those experiences. And part of it is I'm thinking in my mind the 24-hour, the 4-day fast, which is we've had participants, I don't know if we told you this, but they're still convinced that we put mushrooms in their tea in the morning before we sent them out, and no, we didn't, but they're still, no, we know you did that, because of the sort of the experiences that they have were psychedelic, I guess. And I'm wondering if there might be some overlap with the research going into the psychedelics in the brain, which is much more popular, sexy media. There's so much of that in the media. I wonder if there's something with that in the nature experience as well, that it's just not it's so simple and so accessible, that maybe there's a overlap. It's not getting studied.
A lot of the approach and the methods that we use are borrowed from fields that are older. A lot of we ask our research questions is based on the exercise and cognition literature, right? Exercise is an intervention that is thought to improve brain health, cognition, stress. And then also there's a decent amount of meditation literature studying stress and attention, viewing meditation as that intervention. I totally agree that the psychedelic research that's going off right now, I think there will be a lot of overlap in methods too, right? There's even work happening here at the University of Utah looking at psilocybin and ketamine as a treatment approach for chronic opioid use and chronic pain. So I totally see all of these things as going hand in hand, right? They're all just alternative interventions for health and well-being that I think a lot could be borrowed. So many, the work that we've done taking research participants on multi-day camping trips, pretty much every single trip, there's at least a participant that says, you should do this study, but have people take mushrooms and see if the benefits of being in nature are amplified if you have also give them mushrooms. So I agree. I think there is a lot there, and a lot of kind of collaboration that can happen in terms of approach, methods, what are the outcome measures that we're measuring, how we're measuring them, things like that.
I'm wondering, just tracking back to your original story about stroke, and I'm wondering whether, I know from our conversations that a lot of your research has been with kind of everyday situations, everyday people. Is there an interest in looking at people who have suffered neurological damage or decay alongside stress and anxiety in terms of nature work?
Absolutely. I think for me, that's the ultimate goal of this field, right? Sure, we can identify biomarkers maybe of stress, of attention, of brain health, but how do we then apply that knowledge for good, right, is the ultimate goal. And so I would love if we got to a place of being able to identify what these reliable changes are, how they apply to different populations, and then how do they apply when different populations have different maybe neurological disorders that don't necessarily follow the rules of what, I hate the term that science uses of the normal brain, right? because what is normal, even when it comes to people's brains or experiences? But
sounds like normal now is like highly medicated, urban, indoor, sedentary, right? Like all these interventions are to make us abnormal. Probably that.
Oh, it is really true. It's like we're looking for some sort of intervention to bring us away from the thing we created that made us all stressed and unhappy to begin with.
That's like the underlying story of this whole conversation. Yes.
There's Miriam, I don't know if I shared with you all, but we just received a few different grants to be able to look specifically at bedridden hospital patients, kind of for that exact reason that you're talking about. So our question is basically, right, like nature on the brain and the body. And there's all sorts of interesting findings that we're starting to replicate both in our lab and in others. But it's all happening under the assumption that people have access to nature. And so the work that we're doing now, we're collaborating with the Department of Neurosurgery here at the School of Medicine at the University of Utah to explore whether VR nature can be a surrogate experience for individuals that don't have access to nature. So we're working actually with epilepsy patients. These are people that have treatment-resistant epilepsy, and they come to the University of Utah and undergo brain surgery to get some electrodes implanted into their brain. So they kind of get drilled through the skull into deep brain structures for the neurologist to localize and monitor where are the seizures coming from deep within the brain. And so these patients, while they're being observed, are in bed for up to 2 weeks. And obviously in that situation do not have access or even views of nature. And so we're going to be putting them in VR nature versus VR urban environments and do like within patient comparison while we record stress physiology with electrocardiography or ECG. We're gonna ask them, similar how we do on your veteran trips, ask them about their experience in these different environments, and then also be able to look at that underlying brain activity deep within the brain, where we have electrodes in areas of the brain kind of related to emotion and pain to the environment that we're in. So it'll be really insightful, I think, not only for giving us information about people that don't have access to nature. It'll be insightful for understanding those deeper brain structures that we can't access just with the scalp electrodes. But mostly, and to your point, Miriam, it'll give us insight into this this neurosurgical population that does have chronic brain damage from chronic seizures. And maybe there's some insight to be gained there specifically about this population and their experience in different types of environments. That's definitely not been explored in our field yet. So
when you say VR, do you mean virtual reality? And does it work? This is fascinating. Does the VR work? Because I know that my experience of being in nature is that it's like we talked about spiritual, but it's multisensory. In a way that feels more limited when I'm sitting here at my desk on the computer. It opens up the centers, all those centers, and connects them in a way that doesn't at home in my house. Do you find that the VR virtual reality it will still have that effect of opening up those centers because they have experienced it before?
Really good question, right? Because we're out in nature, we're engaging all 5 senses plus whatever senses we don't even know about, right? Whereas when we're just looking at simulated nature, that's either just a single sense of vision. Sometimes with VR, with virtual reality, you can integrate other senses like scent, or maybe put a little breeze on people sort of thing. Most virtual reality headsets have speakers that you can integrate sounds. So I totally agree. I think I expect that immersion in real nature is going to be the most powerful because it's a multisensory experience and you get the benefit of being away, right? Like leaving your typical environment, going elsewhere that's hopefully associated with less stress. Whereas with VR, right, the whole point of it is that I could put it on right here sitting in my office and escape mentally. There's been a lot of work that's been done looking at pictures of nature. There's been work that's been done looking at videos of nature. There's been work looking at virtual reality nature and then real nature. A ton of success with pictures of nature when it comes to stress physiology. So that's kind of a big push in our field is some exposure science, we call it. So what is the amount of nature that you need, whether that's time, like does 15 minutes in nature versus 15 days in nature have a big difference? But also the extent of the type of nature. 15 minutes in virtual reality versus 15 minutes in a real nature environment. What's that comparison? It's a huge interest in the field right now of trying to answer those sorts of questions. Miriam, about do you really think that it's going to be as impactful? I think the nature lover in me says no, because, there's something you can't describe about being out in nature. But the scientist in me and the outcome-oriented person in me would really love if there were alternatives for people that can't access nature or only have a 10-minute break between meetings and want some sort of benefit. I think people believe there's something, right? If you have a Mac computer, all the backgrounds are always nature scenes, right? Or the names of all the software updates are Ventura, Sonoma, Yosemite, right? Like all these nature oriented scenes. So it's there.
But even us talking about nature is making me happy. It brings up the memories.
Maybe mental imagery can do it too.
It makes me think of two things. One is the book, I think it's Overstory, where isn't there a video game creator in the book who connects to saving the redwood forest because of the world that he created in the video game? And then I was actually one of the participants who's become a really good friend from our programs. He came out here to the Oregon coast, and we were up in the Kalmiopsis wilderness, and we're standing there. It was all like snowy and stuff, and actually it wasn't snowing. That was another day. But we're standing at the same vista, same view, and he stands there and he's like, "This is just like the video game I played for like 5 years when I was kind of better about Wyoming," right? He's just like, "This is amazing." So I think it does go both ways, Okay, we, connecting through an artificial or man-made image of something, and then actually might motivate to get out there, or might build a connection that, isn't limited to that sort of artifice. Anyways, two little anecdotes.
We're talking about all of this almost through the lens, because I know it's true for the three of us. I'm sure it's true for many of the people that come through your program, and it's definitely true for a lot of our research participants that live in Utah, which is such a nature heavy state, through the lens of people already have this existing connection to nature, right? That I think it's a really interesting question too, about what about people that they don't have those memories of a nature space that they can relate to. They have zero preconceived notion about any benefit of being in nature. I think that's like a really interesting question to me of, is nature powerful enough to overcome people that don't have those existing connections or memories? It's hard to control for that, I guess, unless you like intentionally recruit people that have never spent time in nature, have never gone on a hike. But
you can find all those people in Japan, like all those, the people in Japan that never leave their little apartment building and just spend their whole life online. There's like a movement in Japan with these dogs, and then take them out into nature. Like that would be like a good control group, I think.
I'm going to say anecdotally that is my experience of people who haven't had experiences in nature. It's this huge, like a door opening. That's my experience of it. A lot of fear, and then when they're out there, it's like, gosh, this really? So it's really interesting to watch, because it is always preceded with a lot of fear and resistance. I think just mainly because it's different and it's unknown.
I'm curious about your perspective on the pitfalls of nature-based interventions. and one thing that comes to mind is the conversations we've had about, there's the experience of going into wilderness, let's say on one of our trips for 5 days, 7 days, and then coming home and, there's this great, maybe mystical, maybe calming and relaxing experience, and then coming right back into an urban environment and the challenge of that. I'm wondering where the wilderness-based interventions kind of are falling short, or maybe become a sort of, from a psychological perspective, like a bypass to other interventions that might be more useful or more easily integrated. I know we don't want to look at that most of the time, but I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Because I think one of our driving questions in our research is like, how long do the benefits last, if at all, right? Like, or is this something that you come right back to your urban environment and immediately you're flooded with like the stress of all the things you need to get done now being home, and it dissipates quickly? Or does it like kind of carry through into your life after that? And I know the three of us have talked about that a lot in terms of your programming and approach to your organization in wilderness therapy. And I guess I don't know how much of my personal opinions I'll share. One of the concerns is there's not, with adolescents at least, there is often not consent for being in the wilderness. I think consent is a big thing that would really determine, and like the desire to be there, that could determine some of the benefits or potential harms of being in like a sparse wilderness for a long period of time. Like I do believe the desire has to be there. And I'm not saying it always has to be enjoyable. I think we've all experienced like type 2 fun in the wilderness can be very beneficial, but even if it's miserable in the moment. But I think in some of at least my experiences in like wilderness-based programs, that's been a pitfall at times. Often there's no follow-up, right? But we'll go on a trip. I mean, I hiked the PCT and then went right back to LA into a cubicle research job where I sat in traffic for an hour and a half a day, where like there are aspects of the experience of being out in nature for months at a time that have changed just who I am innately as a person, but that also a lot of the benefits of clarity of thought and lower stress just quickly dissipated, right when I got back into the city. Follow through is like the way to go. With my wilderness therapy work experience, there was little to no follow through after people were in nature for a long time, unless the client took it upon themselves to get enrolled in some sort of other program after the wilderness therapy experience. That's where like programs continuing the support even after the nature immersion intervention would be key.
Yeah, one thing we've seen is also it's like lack of follow through, and then also, I don't know how to exactly say this, but a sort of idealization of the wilderness experience. Like if I could only we're talking about people that are maybe depressed in their current life situation, and then they're like, if I can only get back out there where everything makes sense, maybe that's, definitely experienced that myself, and almost create this even further, from a psychological perspective, like a further sort of decline. It's like it feels more, maybe this is what you're saying with the going on the PCT and then back to the cubicle job, like the two-dimensional walls of the cubicle seem way more two-dimensional after you've had that like numinous experience, right? And that's one of the things we're like, man, how do we definitely try to do a lot of integration, and because of that we've seen so much challenge in that return phase.
Yeah, at least from personal experience, I've felt that as well. I wonder if making it almost like a habit building thing of we just did this like amazing week-long trip. We all benefited for this reason and that, and we're going to come back and not only still have the support from the program of the like reintegration piece, but also how can I try to recreate that experience at a smaller dose that's more accessible in my day-to-day life, whether that's like go on a week-long trip all the time, but I can go walk in the urban park for an hour twice a week or whatever, almost to kind of keep that idea on the forefront of your mind. Almost, I think would be a really cool approach. And
I think that's why I've found and so excited about our continued work together, because I think it opens up options, which are inaccessible if you're talking about a week in the wilderness. But it also, for me, as I've been looking a lot at privilege in nature, I've been looking at that over the last week and who has access and who hasn't. If it can also research this can also push forward policy about urban areas and how we're treating them and what people get access to and how we're destroying them, then, I think that's another application perhaps of this research of saying, hey, we need this, guys.
Yeah, this applies to so many different lenses of not only cognitive neuroscience, but clinical psychology, architecture, right? How are we integrating green into our built spaces? Urban planning, it's huge for where are we placing nearby nature in a city, right? That the hard thing with it, which is going to be true in any field, we all work in our siloed little labs, right? How do you actually bring it all together and bring all the people together with their different expertise to be able to integrate what we've learned into all these different facets, which I think is what's cool about working with you all, right? Is we're doing this kind of behind the scenes research on the impacts of nature on health and well-being, but you all are the ones that are actually doing this work, right? And bringing those benefits to people that need them. So it's possible, I think, to build those bridges.
How is that collaboration happening now? Are there opportunities where architects, neuroscientists, ecotherapists, politicians are coming together to talk about these things?
Even in the last 7 or 8 years that I've been doing it, I have seen a huge growth in that interdisciplinary approach. There's a group in Washington that's based out of University of Washington called the Nature and Human Health Washington, that basically started a group in the Seattle area. We're all interested in this topic, but we never talk to each other. Let's start with just brewery meetups. And then things like that. Nalini Nadkarni and Tim Brown here in Salt Lake City started a Utah version of that. So they kind of took what UW had created, restructured it a bit to work here in Utah. So we now have the Nature and Human Health Utah group, where every couple months we'll do a meetup somewhere, whether it's at someone's house, at a local aviary, at a brewery, and people can give little presentations about the work that they do. Some really cool collaborations have come out of that for us, working with some community-based organizations here, kind of similar to what we're doing with you all, of how can we help build the infrastructure for program evaluation for these organizations that are doing the work in our own community. So it's starting to happen for sure. REI has an arm called the Cooperative Action Fund that is giving millions of dollars out to different groups, whether they're nonprofits or research groups at universities, to basically kind of push this nature and health agenda with an emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration. So I'm really seeing it even in the last 3 years in our little world starting to happen. A colleague of mine who I went to graduate school with is starting a Nature and Human Health Colorado group to mirror the work done in Utah and Washington. I think interest is totally growing. Word is getting out on this field even being a thing. And I think people are wanting to build those bridges if they can find the infrastructure to do it.
If we're doing is not working. So nature must have some going back to finding some of the older tradition seems to be important these days.
Yes.
It's okay. You're unfrozen.
Another form of environmental action in its own way. There's so many aspects of it, and we can, just by caring about it, just by going out into it, by appreciating it, yes, we will take care of what's around us in a different way. I think, at least, I want to come to your meeting in Utah. That's super cool.
I think you would enjoy those sorts of stuff. It's all people like yourselves, and every conversation I have with you guys of like, we could just talk for hours and hours about all of this stuff. And it's a really diverse group, which I think is important.
Yeah, I feel any of the things we talked about in the last hour, we could have spent an hour on each. There's so much to cover, like so many different things to explore. So
I just wanted to say how excited we are about continuing the research with you, and applying it in a whole lot of different areas. We're applying it with veterans at the moment. We're doing it now with some of the youth that we're taking out who haven't had access into nature, and also using it on almost all of our programs. And it's really exciting to be doing that and to be able to get substantial results. So thank you so much.
I totally agree, Miriam. Dave and I are really excited too. I think this is a perfect illustration of situations where, the hope ultimately, I think the ultimate goal in my mind is to be able to collect some data to better understand what's working, what's not working in the programs you all are offering already, right? Are we optimizing the benefits of nature for the people that we're working with? And then at the same time, you all are already doing the act of bringing people out into nature in this like intervention type way that also presents a unique opportunity to kind of get like more diverse sample. We talked about most of the work that's been done is on primarily white undergraduate university affiliated. And it's great to be able to work with organizations that are bringing more diverse crowds out into nature, whether that's diverse in terms of demographics or personal experiences, right? A lot of your veterans will have different relationship to nature than people that don't have experience in the military. So I think it's a cool and fun approach, and we're really enjoying it.
Well, back to the idea, maybe we'll have to do a subject specific, like dive into something, one of these topics in the future again, and get you back on here. But I really appreciated the time and the work that you're doing, and all of you at the lab.